The world was sliding toward darkness. By the mid-1930s, Europe was a powder keg armies, expanding, leaders roaring, skies filling with the hum of machines. In the shadows, one question haunted every government. Could the enemy strike before we even saw them coming? Britain, an island proud and stubborn, feared the unseeable squadrons of bombers appearing from the clouds without warning. Intelligence reports whispered of a new German technology, a death ray capable of destroying cities from afar. It sounded like fiction, but in 1935, fear itself was a kind of fuel. So the Air Ministry summoned a Scottish physicist, Robert Watson Watt, and gave him an impossible mission: prove or disprove the death ray. What he discovered instead would change the geometry of war. In February 1935, on a quiet field near Daventry, Watson Watt and his assistant Arnold Wilkins aimed a receiver toward the sky. They weren't hunting death, they were chasing echoes. When a Royal Air Force bomber crossed the horizon, the radio waves from the BBC transmitter bounced back a flicker on the screen, a heartbeat in the static. It worked. For the first time in history, the air itself spoke. That faint pulse became Britain's first glimpse of the future, a future where waves could see. The numbers were staggering. By 1937, Britain was pouring £10 million, a fortune equal to its naval budget, into a chain of iron towers along the coast. Each rose nearly 100 meters, forming a line of listening giants. This secret network would be known as Chain Home, a wall of steel and signal stretching from the cliffs of Dover to the cold edges of Scotland. Every tower whispered to the next, scanning the grey sky, feeding on belief, dragging static through the wind. Engineers tuned frequencies between 20 and 30 megahertz, capturing echoes as far as 200 kilometers away. While Europe prepared for battle with bombs and bullets, Britain armed itself with invisible light. Still, outside those laboratories and concrete bunkers, few believed in the unseen. Radar was dismissed as fantasy, science magic, the newspapers scoffed. But in a world racing toward destruction, fantasy was sometimes the only defense left. What Watson Watt had built wasn't just technology, it was a prelude, a silent orchestra warming up before the storm. Because soon, the sky would burn. And when it did, those towers would be the only eyes Britain had. As history would later record, 2,600 enemy aircraft would one day cross that very horizon, dragging the thunder of war behind them. But before that came, in 1935, there was only the hum of a radio, a flicker on a screen, and one man's realization that the air itself could save the world. That was the first heartbeat of radar, the invisible shield that would turn fear into foresight. And in that moment, amid the static and silence, the war for the skies had already begun. By 1937, Britain could feel the tremor before the quake. Europe was arming itself faster than ever recorded in human history. Germany rebuilt its air force, the Luftwaffe, reaching over 4,000 aircraft by the end of the decade. Hitler's voice thundered through radios across the continent, a storm building frequency by frequency. And in the quiet laboratories of England, another kind of army was rising, one made not of men, but of metal towers and silent waves. They called it Chain Home, a name simple enough to hide a revolution. 20 steel giants were raised along the coast, each nearly 330 feet tall, anchored by concrete, humming day and night. The project cost £10 million, an unthinkable gamble in a world still limping from the Great Depression. But Churchill's circle and the Air Ministry understood what most did not. The next war would not be fought in trenches, it would fall from the sky. Engineers worked through fog and cold, hauling beams, dragging cables, bolting steel under relentless rain. Every tower was fed by belief, by urgency, by the ticking clock of inevitability. Beneath the grey sky of Dover and Bordsey, waves of invisible energy reached outward over the sea, searching for the enemy not yet seen. Each radar pulse lasted 25 microseconds, traveling faster than thought, bouncing off the air itself. The echoes came back, jagged, faint, alive, Behind flickering cathode screens, women and men, many barely in their 20s, learned to read the static-like language. A blip here meant metal. 2 blips meant formation. A sweep of light on glass meant incoming death. Still, no one outside the circle believed. The newspapers mocked it as the Ministry of Magic. Parliament asked if the project was another radio fantasy. But Watson, Watt, and his engineers pressed on, convinced that someday soon Britain would need to see through clouds, through night, through fear itself. The irony was brutal. While Britain built its wall of waves, Germany was perfecting the art of annihilation. By 1938, German bombers could carry 2 tons of explosives each. Their average flight speed reached 250 miles per hour, fast enough to cross the Channel in 20 minutes. Civilian casualties from the Spanish Civil War, where the Luftwaffe tested its air raids, had already exceeded 25,000 dead, Guernica's rubble still smoking in the European conscience. The message was clear. When the storm came, it would come from the sky. And yet, inside Britain, the radar network grew like a heartbeat, steady, unseen, relentless. By early 1939, there were 21 fully operational chain home stations stretching from Ventnor on the Isle of Wight to the tip of Scotland. Operators could now detect aircraft 120 to 200 miles away with a precision margin of just a few miles. That gave the Royal Air Force a gift no army in history had ever possessed. Time, 20 minutes of warning, 20 minutes to scramble fighters, warm engines, and climb into position before the enemy arrived. In war, 20 minutes could mean the difference between a burning city and a standing one. When Germany invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939,
that the true
Britain's
potential of the
wall of echoes
experiment
was ready.
became clear.
The war that many feared and few could prevent had begun. Across Europe, cities were already falling under the thunder of steel wings. In Warsaw, 84% of the city's buildings would be destroyed. In Rotterdam, 30,000 civilians lost homes in a single afternoon of bombing. By 1940, Europe had already suffered millions displaced, thousands dead, before Britain even entered the fight for its own sky. And so, on the cold coast of Kent, the operators of Chain Home listened. They listened to silence, to the hiss of sea wind through the masts, to the rhythmic pulse of their machines. Somewhere out there, beyond the Channel, engines were gathering. Every hum of radar was a prayer that Britain would not be blind when the storm arrived. In the underground control room at Bentley Priory, analysts plotted dots on a massive wall map, colored strings connecting coastal stations. They called it the Dowding System, a marriage of radar data and human decision, the first digital defense network in the world. For the first time in history, war would be fought with information. And yet, beneath that calculated brilliance lay human fragility. Young women working headsets for 12-hour shifts, pilots sleeping in cockpits, waiting for alarms, families scanning the horizon for planes that might never come. The pressure was suffocating, but belief held the line. Because every signal mattered. Every faint return on the oscilloscope might be the warning that saved London or the silence before fire. By spring 1940, the towers stood ready, humming like organs in a cathedral of steel. The system covered nearly 1,000 miles of coastline, each site manned around the clock. It was the largest integrated electronic defense network on Earth. No one yet knew that within months, it would face the full fury of 2,600 German aircraft unleashed against Britain. No one yet knew that radar, the ghostly whisper of radio waves, would become the sound of salvation. But history was already in motion. The wall of echoes was complete. And somewhere across the Channel, engines were warming. The storm was coming. And in the next chapter, the sky would burn. By the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone. France had fallen in 6 weeks. The Nazi flag waved across Europe, dragging dust from the ruins of Warsaw to the shores of Calais. Now, only 21 miles of sea separated Hitler's empire from the island that refused to bow. And in that narrow strip of grey water, the fate of democracy hung by radar wires and fighter wings. The Luftwaffe gathered on the French coast, 2,600 aircraft, sleek and lethal, fueled by conquest. On paper, the math was merciless. Britain had no more than 700 operational fighters, many patched with bullet holes, engines overworked, pilots sleepless. The Germans expected collapse in a matter of weeks. "The English Air Force will be crushed like an egg," Hermann Goering boasted. But what the enemy couldn't see was that Britain now possessed something no nation had ever wielded before: sight beyond the horizon. The radar towers of Chain Ho were no longer mere steel skeletons on the coast. They were oracles. They whispered to the command rooms of Bentley Priory, where maps lit up with glowing markers. The instant a German squadron left the French coast, radar stations from Dover to Ventnor caught the faint echo metal reflected on waves of radio light. That echo gave the Royal Air Force 20 minutes of warning. 20 minutes to scramble. 20 minutes to turn chaos into counterattack. It was a miracle measured in minutes, and in those minutes, history bent. At 6:05 a.m. on the 10th of July 1940, the Battle of Britain began. For 114 days, the sky became an open wound. Radar pulses bounced off storm clouds, smoke, and wings. On the ground, women in headsets relayed coordinates at breakneck speed. Pilots sprinted across fields, hauling blades into motion, engines roaring like angry gods. Every launch was a gamble, every flight a question of survival. Between July and October, the Luftwaffe dropped over 35,000 tons of explosives across England. London burned. Coventry vanished in a night. Portsmouth, Southampton, Bristol, all scarred. Entire streets turned to ash. Civilian casualties surpassed 43,000 dead, another 139,000 wounded. The smell of smoke became the smell of morning. And yet Britain did not break, because behind the flames, the radar lines held.
The adjustment is complete.
Station
we have
fed
stable
data
transmission
to fighter
at
command,
30 megahertz.
weaving chaos into coordination. From those towers, Britain could see the storm before it hit. While London hid underground, the screens in dark rooms glowed brighter. While children slept in subway tunnels, men and women traced green dots on glass, turning the abstract hum of radio into defense strategy. The results defied logic. In August 1940 alone, Germany lost 774 aircraft, 3 times the British count. By the battle's end, the Luftwaffe had lost 1,733 planes and over 2,600 trained airmen, a wound the Reich would never heal. How did an island of 47 million defy a war machine that had consumed half a continent? The answer pulsed in those invisible waves. Radar didn't fire bullets. It bought time. And time saved nations. Historians later called it the Battle of the 20 Minutes. Every intercepted message, every echo received, gave Britain just enough warning to climb higher, strike faster, survive longer. But survival had a price. RAF pilots lived in a cycle of takeoff, fire, crash, repair, repeat. Many never saw a second dawn. The average life expectancy of a Spitfire pilot during the height of battle was 4 weeks. At night, the ones who lived sat in silence, staring at the stars they'd fought under. They called themselves the Few. When Winston Churchill addressed the House of Commons that September, his words carved themselves into history. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. But even Churchill knew the truth. The few were not just the pilots. They were also the women behind the radar screens, the engineers tuning frequencies by hand, the mechanics dragging engines through mud, the scientists who turned fear into foresight. Without radar, the RAF would have flown blind. Without Chain Home, the war might have ended before it began. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. But even Churchill knew the truth. The few were not just the pilots. They were also the women behind the radar screens, the engineers tuning frequencies by hand, the mechanics dragging engines through mud, the scientists who turned fear into foresight. Without radar, the RAF would have flown blind. Without chain home, the war might have ended before it began. By late September, the tides began to turn. German bombers still came, but fewer returned. The radar towers kept humming, some hit by bombs, yet still transmitting. Even when power failed, operators used car batteries to keep the signals alive. In October, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion, his plan to invade Britain indefinitely. The invasion fleet rusted at its moorings. Britain had survived the impossible. A nation, half-starved, bombed, and sleepless, had held the sky. Yet victory carried a shadow. London was rubble, families displaced, children orphaned. Nearly 2 million homes lay in ruins. The war was far from over. It had merely shifted its shape. The battle for the skies had proven one thing. The war of the future would belong not to the strongest, but to the smartest. And in that truth, radar became more than technology. It became symbol. Proof that intelligence, coordination, and faith could outmatch brute power. As 1,941 dawned, Britain rebuilt. The radar network expanded northward, new towers rising like defiant monuments against the grey. The hum of radio waves filled the coast again, fed by belief, unbroken by exhaustion. Because though the Battle of Britain was won, the world was still burning. And soon, across oceans and deserts, radar would travel with every fleet, every bomber, every convoy, spreading like light through darkness. The age of invisible warfare had begun. And in the next chapter, radar would not just save a city, it would help save the world. The storm did not end, it only changed its direction. By 1941, the skies above Britain were quieter, but the war had spread like a virus. Across Europe, cities were erased, borders redrawn in fire. Radar had saved London, but it had also awakened a new truth. Whoever could see first would rule the next phase of war. Britain's chain home network, once a desperate experiment, now became the nervous system of the entire Allied defence. From the icy waters of Scotland to the cliffs of Dover, the radar towers pulsed day and night, each signal an invisible heartbeat in a continent of chaos. The numbers were staggering. Between 1,940 and 1,941 alone, Germany dropped over 45,000 tons of bombs on British soil. London was hit 57 nights in a row during the Blitz. 2 million homes destroyed, 43,000 civilians dead, 139,000 injured, and yet the island still stood. The radar towers kept humming, their metal ribs lit by the glow of moon and fire. When the U-boats came next, radar evolved. In 1941, Britain adapted the same principle to the sea. ASDIC sonar and airborne radar began hunting submarines that once haunted the Atlantic. Convoy losses dropped by 60% in a single year. The hunted had become the hunter. It wasn't just Britain anymore. The invisible art of detection was spreading across the Allied world. American scientists at MIT built the radiation laboratory, pushing radar frequencies into the microwave range. They called it the centimetric radar, small enough to fit into aircraft noses. What had once required a 100-foot tower could now ride aboard a bomber. By 1942, radar was no longer secret, it was salvation. Allied bombers flew through fog and darkness, guided by the pulse of electronic sight. At Dunkirk, it had helped rescue 338,000 soldiers. At El Alamein, it helped track Rommel's convoys across desert nights. In the Pacific, it warned carriers of incoming strikes that could have drowned fleets. But the technology that saved lives also illuminated death in staggering scale. Between 1,939 and 1,945, World War II would claim over 70 million human lives, 1 out of every 30 people on Earth. Half of Europe's industrial capacity lay in rubble. In Warsaw alone, 85% of the city was destroyed. In Stalingrad, over 2 million soldiers and civilians would die in less than 6 months. The world was burning, and radar had become its unblinking witness. In London's underground war rooms, The hum of machines was constant oscillators, amplifiers, cathode screens flickering like ghost fire. The operators, young women in pressed uniforms, barely out of school, watched for blips that meant life or death. One misread echo could cost thousands. Every pulse of static felt like holding the heartbeat of a nation between trembling fingers. The Germans, desperate to blind the system, launched Operation Donnerkeil, a coordinated air assault meant to overwhelm radar sites. But the British adapted, refining signal filters, rotating frequencies. When German bombers jammed channels, the engineers countered within hours. The battle was no longer just of planes and bullets, it was a duel of frequencies, invisible but ferocious. The irony was almost poetic. A war once defined by brute force was now decided by mathematics, electricity, and the calm patience of scientists. The booming guns were loud, but the quiet machines were louder in consequence. By 1943, radar had matured into a vast web, thousands of installations linking Britain, North America, and the Mediterranean. Fighter interceptions were now guided not by guesswork, but by data. In that year alone, Allied night fighters destroyed over 1,700 German bombers, most detected long before they reached target. And yet, the war kept devouring.
A
In
military
Hamburg,
documentary
July
showing close-up images
1943,
of the rubble
Allied
and
bombers
thick
unleashed
smoke of Guernica,
9,000 tons
viewed
of
through a
explosives,
ragged window frame.
creating a firestorm that burned for a week, killing 40,000 civilians. Radar had made bombing precise, but precision in war still meant death. No longer blind, humanity was now terrifyingly efficient. Still, the technology that darkened cities was the same that saved fleets, pilots, and civilians. In a cruel paradox, radar became the balance between annihilation and survival. On the ground, the British radar network expanded again, chain-home low stations, detecting low-flying aircraft, and the GEE navigation system guiding Allied planes over Europe. The once fragile network of 20 towers had grown into more than 200 radar posts, each one an iron sentinel wired into the veins of global conflict. By late 1944, when Allied troops stormed Normandy, radar directed their every move. From ships in the Channel to aircraft overhead, every wave and wind change was tracked. It was radar that guided the 6,939 vessels of the D-Day fleet safely through fog and minefields, the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Without it, the beaches of Normandy might have become graves instead of gateways. The statistics of that day alone stunned the world. 156,000 soldiers landed, 11,000 aircraft in the sky, over 195,000 naval personnel in motion, all synchronized by invisible pulses born from one Scottish physicist's 1935 experiment with a BBC signal. From Chainholme's towers to the beaches of France,
the signal.
the
Reroute
arc
through
of
the auxiliary
technology
dish.
had become the arc of survival.
Do you
But
copy?
victory still carried ash in its teeth. Across Europe, radar stations watched cities vanish into smoke. Hamburg, Dresden, Berlin, proof that even progress has a cost. Each flicker on a radar screen could mean either rescue or ruin. Still, Britain endured. The once broken island had become the nerve center of Allied intelligence. And in the humming halls of Bletchley Park, as codebreakers deciphered enemy messages, the rhythm of war changed once again, from sound to silence, from gunfire to radio waves. The world was shifting toward its final act. The radar that had saved London would soon guide bombers to Tokyo. The
See how the blip
technology
leaves
of
the
defense would
formation? You
become
need to
the
compensate
tool
for
of
that phase
dominance.
difference using
And
this
yet,
dial.
beneath
Okay,
the
tracing the
triumph
blip
and
now.
ruin,
It's stabilizing.
one truth glowed faintly in the static. Human ingenuity, fed by fear, sharpened by courage, could see through the darkest clouds. The storm was ending. But in the next chapter, as the fires dimmed and the towers fell silent, humanity would face the question that radar could not answer. What happens when we can see everything, but still cannot stop ourselves? The guns went silent in May 1945, but the air was still full of echoes. Smoke lingered over the ruins of Europe like the breath of a dying giant. London, scarred, tired, unbowed, stood under skies that no longer screamed. Radar towers, once vibrating with the pulse of war, now hummed like ghosts of victory. Britain had survived. The numbers told a miracle written in ash. Over 70 million people dead worldwide. 2/3 of Europe's cities destroyed. 43,000 British civilians killed in the Blitz. But amid the wreckage, the towers of Chain Home still stood steel ribs of endurance, pointing skyward as if in defiance of gravity itself. They had been built to predict death, but in their endurance they foretold something else, the dawn of a new age. When peace came, the soldiers went home, but the scientists did not. The war had fed their belief that knowledge could save nations, and now that belief demanded purpose. The radar engineers, the mathematicians, the women of the plotting rooms, they refused to let the silence consume them. They took what was born of fear and hauled it into the light. In 1946, Britain's radar network was restructured under Project Rotor, transforming wartime defense into Cold War vigilance. Across oceans, the United States built the distant early warning line, a chain of radar outposts stretching from Alaska to Greenland, towers of steel standing in snow and isolation, eyes against the unseen. The Cold War had inherited the gift and the paranoia of radar alike. But beneath the politics, there was poetry. What had once been a weapon became a language, a way of seeing the unseen, of mapping the invisible. The same radio waves that once found bombers now guided airliners across the Atlantic. The same oscillators that once screamed warnings to London now mapped storms before they struck. The same frequencies that once trembled in fear of invasion now pulsed through hospitals, birthing medical radar, what we now call MRI. It was as if humankind had turned the echo of destruction into an instrument of healing. And yet, the ghosts of war never truly fade. The ruins of radar towers on England's coast became monuments of quiet power. Visitors came students, veterans, children standing under their rusted frames, listening to the wind whistle through the steel like static. Somewhere deep inside, they could still feel the vibration of a century's heartbeat. The legacy of radar was not just technological, it was moral. It proved that vision alone was not enough. You must decide what to do with what you see. In the years that followed, radar transformed into the backbone of a new kind of peace, a peace held together not by trust, but by observation. The nuclear age had arrived, and the world's survival depended on who saw first. America and the Soviet Union built early warning systems capable of detecting missiles 3,000 miles away. The very idea of mutual assured destruction depended on radar, the eye that must never blink. Humanity had conquered blindness, but not fear. And yet, even amid that tension, there was progress, scientific, moral, almost spiritual. Radar research laid the foundation for radio astronomy, leading to the discovery of pulsars, quasars, the very echo of the Big Bang itself. The same technology that once listened for death now listened for the birth of the universe. That is the paradox of human genius. Every tool of war can become a tool of wonder. Robert Watson Watt, the man who had sparked it all in 1935 with a BBC broadcast and a dream of protection, lived to see his invention circle the globe. He was knighted by the Crown, then retired quietly to Canada. When asked near the end of his life if he regretted creating the technology that made modern warfare more efficient, he smiled and said, "Give me radar peace as well as radar war." He died in 1973, but his words still hum in every transmission, every echo bouncing off the clouds. Because radar was never just about machines, it was about faith in the unseen.
Tracking hostile.
It was proof that the human mind could look into the void and find meaning. In every conflict since the Cold War standoffs, the Gulf War, the tracking of storms, the search for lost aircraft radar has remained humanity's second sight, forever peering through fog, smoke, and fear. And if you listen closely, you can still hear the rhythm of it, the slow, steady pulse of electromagnetic light sweeping across the earth. Each revolution is a whisper of history, a reminder that even in our darkest ages, we built tools not only to destroy, but to endure. From the ashes of London's Blitz to the soft glow of modern airport radars, the story remains the same. We learned to see so that we might survive. But perhaps the truest legacy lies not in the towers or the screens, but in the people who believed when no one else did. The nameless operators who stayed awake through the long nights of 1940. The young women who drew green arcs on black glass, guiding tired pilots home. The scientists who turned static into symphony. They were the guardians of the unseen. They didn't just build machines, they built hope. And so the tale of radar is not just a story of steel, circuits, or victory. It is the story of how human vision outlasted fear. Black and white became grey. Grey turned to light. The noise became signal. The static became song. And as the world moved forward, dragging dust, hauling blades, fed by belief, the towers on the English coast faded into history, their metal bones rusting quietly beneath the gulls. But if you stand there now, on a windy morning, you can still hear it. A faint hum, an echo traveling through time. Not the sound of war, but the sound of humanity learning to see.